Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to do a review of the Zeiss Otus 55mm f1.4 lens. I had the privilege last fall of reviewing the 85mm big brother of this lens, and I was looking forward to giving the 55mm a review and spend some time with it as well. Over the past several years, I've reviewed a number of 50mm options, and about 10 modern lenses, and then on top of that, probably another 6 or 7 legacy or vintage 50mm lenses. And so I've spent a lot of time with 50mm lenses, but this of course represents the pinnacle of what you can get at a 50mm lens. Now, right off the bat, let's just clear the air regarding some of the biggest negatives regarding this lens. Number one, it is a manual focus only lens, as you're probably aware. On top of that, it is also very large. It's much closer to the size of, say, this 24 to 70mm f2.8 zoom than what it is to, well, this little fellow, which is the new Canon EF 50mm f1.8 STM lens. And of course, the other thing about the Zeiss is that it's incredibly expensive. In fact, by my calculation, you could buy about 32 of these for the price of just one of the Zeiss Otus lenses. So what is it about the Otus line that makes them worth, or are they worth, such a massive price tag? If you watched my review of the 85mm f1.4 Otus lens last year, you know that despite those obstacles, it's even more expensive, it's even larger than this lens. I was so impressed by its optical performance that I came to the conclusion that while it's hard to say that a lens is justifying a price of $4,500 for that lens, I thought that it probably came pretty close. It was an incredible optic that just blew my mind with its resolution, its contrast, and just the quality of the images it produces. I've spent now about a month and a half with the Otus 55, and I came away with the conclusion that while I slightly prefer the 85mm focal length to that of the 55mm focal length, I have to say that this lens is another incredible achievement for Zeiss. Now let's take a closer look here at some photos of the actual build. You can see as we look at these photos that this lens is beautifully, beautifully constructed. Zeiss, as I've said before, doesn't hardly know what plastic is, but everything is made out of high quality materials. Everything is metal construction, and along with a very exotic, expensive glass elements. And of course, Zeiss has its famous coatings that are really the best in the world when it comes to that. The focus ring on this lens is a rubberized focus ring, and it has just the perfect amount of damping. If every manual focus lens focused like the Otus line, I think that people might be a whole lot more open to the concept of manual focusing lenses. It really does focus like a dream, and the weight on the focus is so light that you can focus with a finger, but at the same time it's not too loose to where you feel like you would easily lose a position or wouldn't be able to dial down a fine focus. It has electronic coupling to the camera itself, and so it has focus confirm on it. And as a result, if you are using a body that has some kind of sensitivity to manual focus, I'm using a Canon 6D body for the most part for the review of this lens. And while Canon bodies are really, they're some of the worst when it comes to manual focus. But the good news is that with the use of an EGS focus screen that I've swapped out, and if you're going to shoot manual focus lenses, do yourself a favor and swap out for one of those. It makes manual focus so much easier. With that, you can see the true depth of field, and so it helps you to really be able to visually see when focus is achieved. Combined with the focus confirm chip in the lens, I have a very easy time manually focusing Zeiss Otus lenses. And the truth of the matter is, it's very rare that I come home with an image that isn't properly focused. Now, as I've said, this is a large lens, and when it comes to 50mm lenses, it is the largest and the heaviest of any that I'm aware of for a full frame or 35mm system. And the Sigma Art Series 50mm f1.4 is also a large lens, but this is heavier still, primarily because it's all metal construction. It's about 5.66 inches long, or a little right under 14.5 centimeters, and it weighs in at a fairly hefty 2.27 pounds, and that is about 1,030 grams. And so while its overall dimensions are roughly similar to this 24-70 lens, it is a several hundred grams heavier than what that lens is. This has a 9 rounded blade aperture, and you will find from this comparison series here that I'll show you as we look at the aperture that through f2.8 the aperture stays pretty much perfectly round. Around f4 you begin to see just the beginning of the shape of the aperture blades, and then by about f5.6 it becomes more pronounced. This has a rather unimpressive and very average magnification of about 0.15 times, and you can focus down to 19.7 inches with it. Both of those are fairly standard figures for a 50mm lens. But beyond that, there's a reason why this lens is perhaps justifies its incredibly high price tag, and that is the image quality. Nothing, and yes, not even the Sigma 50mm f1.4, nothing touches the image quality in a 35mm system of the Otus series. Really, you have to start comparing them to medium format systems and medium format resolution before you start to get a sense of how highly this resolves. Its resolution set a new standard for 50mm lenses, and that resolution begins at wide open at f1.4. When Zeiss's engineers set out to build the Otus series, they were given a kind of an engineer's dream, and that was they could spend as much money as they want. They could make a lens that was as large and as expensive as they wanted. They just needed to make it the best, and that's exactly what they did. First with this 55mm, and then with the 85mm Otus following that. These lenses resolve just amazingly, and as you can see, for example, of this picture of a landscape image, wide open, f1.4, it's sharp from corner to corner, and if you zoom in, the resolution holds up. The contrast is beautiful. I find that with many wide aperture primes that they're kind of optimized for a certain focal length, usually within a portrait range. But the Otus lenses, it doesn't matter where you focus throughout the kind of focus range, they continue to be sharp, contrasty, and produce beautiful image quality, whether it's up close or whether it's all the way at infinity focus. And that makes them unique amongst any other wide aperture primes that I've used. Even the Sigma, although it's amazingly sharp at certain settings, when you get out towards infinity, it begins to have a bit of that haze that just shows a little bit lack of contrast and resolution. But the Otus series, they remain perfectly sharp and perfectly contrasty. In fact, that combination of that extreme resolution along with that incredible contrast that really has to be seen to believe means that the portraits that you produce with this are really kind of unparalleled in the look of them. Once you become familiar with the output of this lens, you instantly recognize images that are taken by it because of that extreme resolution. So it's incredibly sharp on your subject. And then, of course, there's amazing contrast. But then on top of that, it has the ability to beautifully render bokeh out of focus regions, and it transitions beautifully from focus to defocus and then produces beautifully soft and artful out of focus areas. And so as a result, you get at portrait distances anywhere from 10 to 20 feet, you can shoot wide open f1.4, have an incredibly sharp subject, but amazing separation of your subject from the background, and it produces an intensely three-dimensional effect that is uniquely awesome and goes beyond anything that I've really used before. The only lens that does it as well or better and in this kind of range really is the 85mm Otus, and so they're really incredible for that. And Zeiss has done an amazing job here being able to produce a lens that is not only incredibly sharp, but at the same time it also has amazingly artful rendering of out of focus area. Again, I'm referring back to the Sigma Art series because it really is the closest competitor to this lens in terms of its optics. And of course, it is amazingly sharp, but it's not nearly as artful in the bokeh rendering. I found it kind of ironic, and I noted in my written review that although the other lens has the word art in the name, it's really the Otus that is the more artful of the two. And so when it comes to the optical quality, it's nothing but positives. With one exception, and that exception is it does vignette wide open fairly heavily, as you can see in some of the samples. Now, I know that to some of you that's a desirable effect, and certainly in some situations it is. My opinion is, though, I would rather add that vignetting where appropriate as an kind of an artistic choice rather than it constantly being there. That it may have something to do with the fact that despite being a very large lens, it has a standard 77mm front element. And that's unlike the 85mm. It moves to a somewhat odd-sized 86mm front element. And so perhaps for many of you, the trade-off will be acceptable in that you can probably use existing filters on this lens as opposed to the 86mm standard, which you probably have very few of, if any, in your collection already. And so as far beyond that, however, chromatic aberrations they're basically non-existent, and that also helps with the bokeh rendering because often wide aperture 50mm primes, you know, they're somewhat notorious for, particularly in the bokeh highlights, there being kind of a green fringe around them. And you don't see that with the Otus series lenses. And also on top of that is that it is virtually distortion free, which means that it makes it very useful if you're wanting to shoot and you need only kind of medium distance on architectural type shots. Even interior shots, it enables you to create amazing images because you have that incredible low light performance. And the low light performance of the Otus series is really better than anything else out there because it not only has the wide f1.4 aperture, it's basically perfectly sharp from corner to corner at f1.4, and so it makes it one of the best low light options there is, period. Does all of that justify an extremely high price tag of nearly $4,000? Ultimately, that's up to you, for you to decide. But one thing that I can say about the Zeiss Otus lenses is that there's certainly a difference about them. It's not just that they are good lenses, they are exceptional lenses. And so if you are not put off by either the high price tag or the fact that it's manual focus only, it is a pretty amazing lens to add to your kit. And I really think that for those of you that perhaps do high-end portraiture or wedding photographers and you want to give your clients very unique, individualized looks that are better than anything else out there, take a look at this. You'll find that I think you need to view it as a long-term investment, but if you want work that is set apart in an increasingly competitive landscape where there's so many photographers out there, the Otus lenses are going to give you something that is not just a little bit different, but it is definitely better. I'm Dustin Abbott. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Have a great day.